Today, we're going to begin talking of Paul's letter to the Corinthians. It's the first letter that Paul will write to the Corinthian church. And so you'll want to have that read before you launch into this. And Paul's letters are occasional. That is, they are all addressing specific needs in a specific time and in a specific place. And so, as I said before, it's hard to think about putting Paul's letters and thinking of them as these tomes that are good for thousands of years without context. In other words, if we look at Paul's letters and we simply try to extract information from them, whether or not we describe that information as truth or doctrine, we must be careful. And we must be careful because we have to preserve the sense of the rootedness of these letters in time and space. I will say that's usually a context that's missing in so much of teaching about Paul and about Paul's letters, is their occasional nature. And so Paul's letter to the Corinthians, this first letter to the Corinthians, is one of those that is so burdened with context that it behooves us to really think carefully about what Paul was trying to do, what strategies Paul was using, and the city that he wrote to. I'm going to point out that the presentation today, the letters, it's going to be the slides that we look at. So first, let's talk a little bit just a little bit about the context of this city. So what kind of context did Corinth have? First, the city is strategic. The city is located at the isthmus between the Peloponnese and the mainland. And so at this specific spot, it controlled overland traffic, and it really was a key trade route that allowed people to sail safely. There were two ports on either side of this isthmus. It has a two-part history. Its Greek status as a city-state in the 5th century BC, and then it was destroyed by Lucius Mummius in 148, and then lay dormant for about 100 years when Julius Caesar makes it an official Roman colony in 44. It's close enough a place where the historian Strabo can say that it allowed Rome to kind of take out the trash. That is, a lot of people, the freedmen from Rome, were allowed to take residence in Corinth. There were soldiers that were also settled in Corinth from Caesar's campaigns. And so the complete destruction of the city in 144, you may be able to kind of figure out what that entails. The destruction of the city meant that the city itself was destroyed, but probably had a large kind of surrounding area that was made up of Corinthian Greeks that were ready to come back in the event that the city was re-inhabited. But when it was refounded, the city was completely modeled on a Roman design. So you had Roman roads, a forum, you had an amphitheater. Now the amphitheater probably dates back even further, maybe to the 4th century. The person that you might want to check out on this is Jerome Murphy O'Connor. He's got a wealth of information published, and one particular book on Corinth, and he has done all the work for us. And so a couple of other anecdotes about Corinth as a city. It was a location where they had the Isthmian Games. The Isthmian Games were really the second largest games, other than the Olympic Games, that was held. And Corinth was the major place. It's a big city. It could hold a lot of people. Then the two port towns that were located to the east, let me make sure, to the east of Corinth proper. Those two port towns were able to welcome visitors in a safe way. They had a chair of the Isthmian Games. They had, that is, somebody who was controlling those games. And you remember, perhaps, that when you have that kind of a situation, it always brings religion with it. The Olympic Games were tributes to the gods and to the goddesses, even if people didn't take them significantly, didn't take their significance in terms of life-changing. They were honorific even at that. Of course, in the 4th century, philosophers had already begun to kind of debunk the kind of agency that people might regularly attribute to these gods and goddesses. But that doesn't mean that in the storytelling, they didn't also avow the kind of divine agency that marked their time. Fate, destiny, spiritual powers at work, ones that they could name and ones that they couldn't. There were a lot of people probably that thought that the gods and goddesses were real figures, not unlike more fundamental approaches to religion in our own day. So this gives you a little bit of the cosmopolitan feel of Corinth in the 1st century. When it was built, you had at least 26 different temple sites. This reflects the cosmopolitan nature of the city. And maybe if I get a chance, I'll do a separate video on the archaeological finds and the map of the city itself and how it's arranged. But for what we want to do here, temples ranging from every kind of religious disposition marked the cityscape. Of course, the cityscape itself told a theological story, one that the Romans were willing to tell. After its refounding by Julius, all of the roads led to Rome. The Forum had a temple to the divine Augustus. And that was later in Paul's time, but even at that time, they had temples to the Roman deities and statues, iconography that published the greatness of Julius Caesar. There had been a feature within ancient Corinth that it was kind of like a Las Vegas of its day. However, the more I look at that, the more I question whether or not that was just a lot of propaganda. Maybe it was so just to get people there to spend their money. I don't know. But I think that there's not a lot to that anymore. I used to put more stock in it. So the church and its apostle and the letter that Paul writes. What's this context? If we've set the groundwork in terms of the cosmopolitan nature of the city, that you've got people from all over the world, but a lot of them from Rome, inhabiting this space, it's a bustling metropolis, a new place full of new kind of opportunities, perfectly placed trade route. What drew the Apostle Paul to the church? Well, you recall in the second missionary journey, Paul establishes the church. He has visited there and gets himself in front of Gallio, who had been the kind of consul, the judge in Corinth between 51 and 52. And that provides us a solid anchor point chronologically where Paul can be there, where you've got Roman records that have Gallio there. You also have the book of Acts, which records this event. And then you've got Paul's letter. And all of these things make for a very, a plausible kind of timeline and structure. So let's talk for a moment about the church and its apostle. If Paul started this church, and he puts it together in such a way as to, he stays there for a little while. He goes back on the third missionary journey and actually stays for 18 months. He is very familiar with the church. It's possible, probable in fact, that there are at least 3 letters to the Corinthian church embedded within our 2, 1st and 2nd Corinthians. Not 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians. Let the reader beware. So what's the problem? The problem is that Paul had founded the church on missionary trip number 2, where he writes 1 Corinthians I have to say, I think that this is going to come either from Ephesus or Philippi, but people go back and forth on the location of where Paul may have been writing from. But he has heard back from people about the Corinthian church. And it's a very ad hoc composition. Ad hoc means at hand. So whatever issue was at hand, that's what Paul was dealing with. And so you've got a lot of different issues here. The first issue that you run into when you read this letter is that there's a lot of division. Division about who's following Apollos, who's following Paul, who's following Peter, who's following, you name it. You've got people here in divisions and factions all vying for control. That's the one big issue, the division in the church. The second is some kind of a stratification, whether it is the wise in the faith or the foolish, and who calls who wise and who calls who foolish, whether it is the strong and the weak in the faith, who calls who strong and who calls who weak, whether it is based or predicated on certain moral issues that are impinging upon the church itself. These are all problems that Paul will have to address. The notions of wisdom, the notions of spiritual gifts, all play a role in this letter. The theological significance and the contribution that Paul makes in 1 Corinthians are really stunning. Paul will talk about, in my view, two of the more important places. If you just take 1 Corinthians 13, 14, and 15, you can line them up. Corinthians 13, the love chapter, where Paul describes a love not necessarily meant for the marriage, but you find it read there more often than not, but the love that God gives, almost on a par with Romans chapter 12. And that kind of love that God pours into the hearts of those who believe, those who trust God. 14 is a text on spiritual gifts and the interrelationship between people in the church. But chapter 15 is the resurrection chapter. The chapter where Paul, he doesn't really move from the matrix of whether or not Jesus was raised from the dead. This for Paul was a presumption, a presupposition, a foundation for all his work. What he does is he uses that foundation in order to more generally describe the resurrection of the dead for all believers. So many times people read that and they get it exactly the opposite. They think, well, Paul is writing to describe Jesus' resurrection from the dead. That's a presupposition for Paul. What he's fighting is the Greek notion that such a resurrection of the dead would be abhorrent. This is, of course, you may recall from reading Acts, that when he goes to the Areopagus in Athens, he has very little success there. And one of the charges laid against him, he's a seed picker, a babbler. And when he talks about resurrection from the dead, you can imagine all of the Greek philosophers there, if they were there, the people that generally mill about on the Areopagus, rolling their eyes, thinking about zombies. For the person who is dead, the first thing that they wanted is dirt upon them so they could make their way and cross the Styx successfully rather than get trapped. To think of somebody being raised from the dead is almost beyond their comprehension, and certainly that contributes to it too. So I want to look at another document that it's going to be the outline, the structure, and it's just a survey of this text that I did a few years ago. As you can see, I have it divided up in certain ways, beginning with the salutation in verses 1 through 3 of chapter 1, the thanksgiving. This is the real kind of the introductory part of the letter. And then Paul gets into the main purpose. Now the letter body, you can see that the body of the letter goes all the way to the end of chapter 15. But that's a pretty large section. Can we see any kind of thematic detail that holds these sections together? And this is where it gets hard with a letter that's ad hoc, because Paul will bounce around from place to place. So more about the structure in just a moment.